socialism has gone through many iterations as to what was meant by it. I mean, the most important period of socialism in America was between the late 1890s and up till World War I. And the rise of Eugene Debs was the most important figure. And it was based on a very militant form of demands for essentially socialists. I think they got 12% of the vote at the highest point. The vision came out of an angry working class that was developed in the industrializing period of American society. It was brutally suppressed. Debs was put in prison. After the Red Scare, after the war, wiped out a number of other radicals. So the movement was crushed, and in some cases violently crushed. The attacks were vicious. It has not risen in any significant scale since then. There have been attempts. There was an attempt by Norman Thomas. There's always been a small socialist gathering using that language. But in fact, the word socialism has not been significant in the modern era, except for small numbers of people in different diverse radical groups. So socialist ideas, to a certain degree, are much more prominent. There's a terminology question here, which I think often gets confused, and it's confusing, particularly the way the right wing is using it, but also the way the left uses it. Socialism classically meant the ownership of the major forms of capital in a public or communal way, so that the profits and wealth of that capital and its direction could be used in a common and democratic way. Notice that's different from American welfare state or European welfare states, in which the idea is that the corporations own the capital, and politics is used to attempt to allocate resources for public purposes while the power structure doesn't change. So, for instance, Social Security is often called socialist. It would not be called socialist by a traditional socialist. It is a social program attached to corporate capitalism, or in the European context, that's called social democracy. So the attempt of many American liberals, for instance, and I come out of the liberal tradition. I used to work in the Congress for liberal congressmen and senators. Many people come out of the liberal tradition. That tradition attempted, and still attempts, to manage regulating the corporation and allocating resources through taxing and spending without touching the power structure. The socialist idea was you can't do that. You're going to lose that battle unless you find ways to translate the ownership to large numbers of people in a way that's democratically controlled. Where much of socialism has had a difficulty, and I think needs to be, I think the conservatives were right on this, and the left hasn't acknowledged it, excessive centralization of power comes with if you gave the state all of the capital. And they were right about that. It's a dangerous form. That's why some of the more interesting things that are happening in these themes, whatever they're called, have to do with the decentralized ownership of wealth at the community level, at the workplace level, at the cooperative level. That set of ideas, a participatory vision, is a very different notion. There then may be very important ways that some parts of the ownership of large-scale capital, responding to a community-based buildup of democratic forms, and in a sense controlled by the processes that are democratic that come out of the ground, that form might have the chance of controlling, for instance, the banking structure. The American banking structure is controlled by very small numbers of people who have very different interests at heart than most of the mass of the American people. We've learned that, and we will learn it again, and probably again. Most experts studying it, predicting crises every 5 to 7 years and deepening crises. At some point, who owns and controls that structure? Is it responsive to the people, or is it responsive to the banks and the banking hedge fund managers? That's the kind of question. Which ones need to be under democratic control, not whether the whole system ought to be. And I think what's really interesting about the modern era is the vision of cooperatives, worker-owned companies, land trusts, neighborhood development forms, social enterprise, and the vast expansion of these kinds of efforts are beginning, let me say it carefully, beginning to lay groundwork for a different form of set of ideas that is decentralized, humanistic, and could become the basis over time of a new politics that would have a very different vision than the traditional state kind of directed socialist vision that I think has had its own troubles that we need to acknowledge. The language of this is not yet developed. I mean, in Latin America, you'll find the language of 21st century socialism. But Latin America is a different case. The language I used, and whether it's socialist or the democratic cooperative vision, I've used the language of a pluralist commonwealth. Now, the reason there are plural forms of commonwealth, the most obvious being a co-op or a public utility. There are 2,000 public utilities in the United States. They're operating every day. Some people may say, hey, that's socialism. And of course it is, publicly owned utilities. But on the other hand, it's very decentralized, it's very conventional, it's very practical. That's a different form of common ownership than a co-op or a worker-owned company or the Tennessee Valley Authority or Social Security. These different pieces are very, very different. And they form a plurality of forms of changing ownership away from concentrated corporate ownership, but in a way that democratizes the processes. I think that direction is important, and whether the language of pluralist commonwealth is the right language or some other language, that's to be determined, but the forms are what I think is important.